Thank you, Dominic, and thanks everyone. Look forward to hearing everybody else's stories. But I was introduced to Anthony Trollope when I was 16 years old, and I have to say it was not entirely a success. I had been reading contemporary American political novels, and my English teacher at the time suggested I should try reading Trollope's political novels. Now, I managed to get through Can You Forgive Her and Phineas Finn, but I kind of ran aground on the Eustace Diamonds, which seemed to have almost nothing to do with politics at all. So I gave up on that after a few chapters, and that was really the end of it. Then, about a decade later, there was something of a Trollope revival, and most of his books appeared in the big bookstores here in the States. And that led me to give the Pallisers another chance. Fortunately, Trollope had improved greatly as a writer in the meantime, and I have enjoyed his books immensely ever since. One thing I really appreciate about Trollope is the geniality of his writing, and the fact that for the most part he comes across as a very cheerfully sardonic chronicler who is not afraid to poke fun at his heroes and his heroines, and even at himself. In fact, one of my favorite Trollope passages comes from the Eustace Diamonds, which was the rock on which I previously foundered, in a chapter entitled Mrs. Carbuncle Goes to the Theater. And it goes like this. The three ladies had a box at the Haymarket taken for this very evening, at which a new piece, The Noble Jilt, from the hand of a very eminent author, was to be produced. Mrs. Carbuncle had talked a great deal about The Noble Jilt, and could boast that she had discussed the merits of the two chief characters with the actor and actress who were to undertake them. Miss Talbot had assured her that the Margaret was altogether impracticable, and Mrs. Carbuncle was quite of the same opinion. And as for the hero Steinmark, it was a part that no man could play so as to obtain the sympathy of an audience. There was a second hero, a Flemish count, tame as rainwater, Mrs. Carbuncle said. She was very anxious for the success of the piece, which, as she said, had its merits, but she was sure that it wouldn't do. That, of course, was Trollope's own play, The Noble Jilt, which he never quite managed to get produced, but which was published long after his death. But that was just an example of the kind of thing that I think Trollope did so nicely in his writings, and it's one of the many reasons why I've always found him to be such a great writer to read, ever since I grew up enough to actually appreciate him. And I'll conclude there.
So to talk about Trollope, I actually went back to a short series of blog posts I wrote about 6 years ago about books that changed my life, one of which was The Warden. And I went back and reread it, and actually I don't think I'd change any of it. So I'd like to share some, in the interest of time, some edited highlights from that blog, which I hope you'll find interesting. So it's the mid-1990s, and we're waiting for a bus. My wife dives into the Oxfam bookshop to see what they have. And she emerges a few minutes later with a copy of The Warden. And she says, they had this, and we don't have any Trollope, and I thought you might like it. And that turned out to be one of the greatest understatements she's made in our marriage, because I read the novel over the next couple of days. It set me off reading marathon of Trollope that's lasted until now. And it's a great journey, as you all know, with fascinating characters and a warm, humane guide. And much though I love many Trollope novels, I do come back to The Warden. And in my blog post, I summarised the plot of The Warden, which obviously don't need to do for this audience. But thinking about the plot of The Warden, it's at one level a fairly trivial aspect of the social upheavals taking place in Victorian Britain. But it's also a bit of a microcosm of a battle between what the Victorians would probably have called tradition and reform, the forces of change and the forces of stability and continuity. And as you all know, Trollope was extremely ambivalent about these two forces. He stood as a liberal. Instinctively, he's kind of on the side of reform, but he also regrets some of the things that are passing, and some of the passages he writes in the Warden about the cathedral and how he feels about the church very much bring that out. And I feel that that tension between tradition and reform is one of the things that makes the novel very relevant to us today. You can read it as a depiction of a pivotal point in history, and it's very interesting as such, but it's far more than that, because from the 21st century, we can see that in those terms, reform won comprehensively out over tradition, and the forces of rationality and the free market and mechanization progressively undermined and demolished traditions and the emotional attachments that go with them. And the Church of England has moved ever closer towards collapse, and Parliament has never been held in lower esteem. And in some respects, many of us would see this, at least in part, as a good thing, and we wouldn't necessarily want to return to the deference and the inherited privilege of the past. But there is this question about what's being destroyed in the process, because individual freedom is a good thing, but if we weaken institutions too far, then can society hold together? And that's a tension that's only become more obvious in recent years. And the church may no longer be fit for purpose, perhaps, but do we have anything to replace its moral vision other than more and more consumption? We shouldn't have politicians telling us what's good for us, but if we have government by focus group, then do we just avoid tough decisions? And these questions don't have easy answers, any more than Mr. Harding's dilemma in the novel has easy answers. And of course, as you know, he ultimately follows his conscience by abandoning the hospital and all the people that he's looked after so diligently. But the legal issues around his resignation don't allow for a replacement. And in many ways, this is a very unsatisfactory solution all round, as is the case with so many disputes. But I think what Trollope is suggesting, perhaps in his understated way, is that maybe the situation would have been better handled if all the people involved had actually approached it with humility and with open-mindedness and with a willingness to think the best of each other rather than the worst of each other. And if what would have happened if they'd actually tried to seek a sustainable solution to this issue rather than just win the battle. So as we think about the modern political situation, environmental damage, financial crisis, perhaps it's becoming obvious that progress is not necessarily an unmitigated good. And if we're going to manage all of this to perhaps create a better world, then what we need is the warmth, the humanity, the balance, the thoughtfulness of people like Trollope and maybe even Mr. Harding, perhaps now more than ever. Thank you, that's my thoughts.
Okay, thanks Dom, and hello everyone. I'm Jane and I'm in Bolton, north of Manchester in the UK. I met Anthony around 1969-70 when I was about 14. Interestingly, same as Daniel, it was a copy of The Warden that I purchased at W.H. Smith, which is a big chain bookseller here in the UK, sale copy. And here it is in all its 1970s glory. Interestingly, on the back, it says 95p. So we just moved to decimal currency. And I do think that Plantagenet Palliser would have been very impressed, even if it was 100 years after his efforts. Anyway, and my constant companion and friend and advisor since those days of my youth. We're so close, he actually sends me the odd photograph. And this is one of him and I together the last time that he was in Bolton visiting me. You'll gather that this is no erudite academic analysis. I leave that to those who are much better placed to do it. And I learned a lot through these Zoom meetings to make me think. But this is the average enthusiastic reader's perspective. We all know that Anthony wrote for money. He needed to be popular so that he could earn to counter his fear of penury, support his family, enable his travels and indulge his passion for hunting. He wrote, I think, for a relatively mass market, tales that were easy to read, interesting characters, informed by his intuitive understanding of people and how they relate to each other and make their way through life. His humanity crosses time. We all recognize people in the novels that we think, well, we know someone like that. And he speaks directly to the reader, easing them into a cozy familiarity. An excellent example of this is his revealing of the central mystery of Dr. Wurtle's school in chapter 3. So I'm going to give you a tiny bit here, well, a little bit. And now, O kind-hearted reader, I feel myself constrained in the telling of this little story to depart altogether from those principles of storytelling to which you probably have become accustomed, and put the horse of my romance before the cart. It is my purpose to disclose the mystery at once and to ask you to look for your interest. Should you choose not to go on with the chronicle, simply in the conduct of my persons during this disclosure. I've misread that a bit, you'll have to look it up. And he says at the end, therefore, put the book down if the revelation of some future secret be necessary for your enjoyment. Our mystery is going to be revealed in the next paragraph, in the next half dozen words. Brilliant. I won't say those half dozen words, but they're there. So he's taught me lots of things. No one except possibly Felix Carberry is all good or all bad, and it's all bad. Make decisions and hold firm to them. Forgive if you can't forget, and make sure you have a striking nose if you're a woman. This wonderful writer is top of my Desert Island dinner guest list. What a great bloke to share some food and wine with. And finally, I would like to thank my long-suffering husband for agreeing to grow his facial hair much longer than normal when it was going to be hot and itchy so that I could arrange the photographs. He has never read any Trollope, although he has had to listen to some when I couldn't resist it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mary Bird, Bowie, Maryland, USA. When I moved to Washington, D.C., that was 1986. I was in my 40s. The National Gallery of Art had a special exhibit titled The Great Houses of Great Britain. On display were fine arts, jewels, furniture, and mantelpieces from great manor houses. The gift shop had stacks of novels by Anthony Trollope. I bought one and took it home. I read it. The next week I went back for another novel, and so on throughout the winter. After that winter, my life turned to other pastimes, and once when moving, I donated all my Trollope novels to a library book sale. Big mistake. When I retired about 20 years later, I watched 2 BBC series based on Trollope novels, Barchester Towers and The Pallisers. And I found in my local library the Belton Estate. Then at a yard sale, I found a box containing 50 books by Trollope. I bought it and began reading again. I commented to my book group that every time I went online to search something on Trollope, up popped the Trollope Society UK. I was a little annoyed. One of my group members said, "Why don't you join?" So I did. That was 2018. During COVID, the Zoom book discussions sponsored by the Trollope Society have been something really worthwhile to look forward to and a time to share with people from all parts of the world. When reading Trollope, I focus on the financial lessons he shows. Mark Robarts going bankrupt as he tries to keep up with Lord Lufton's lifestyle. Johnny Eames managing to live in London on a clerk's salary while sending money home to his mother. Lord Felix depending on his mother's work to support him while he gambles it away. Trollope's characters provoke anxiety, love, and hate, and make me laugh out loud sometimes. I enjoy the characterizations in just a few words or dialogue, the wonderful irony and humor in Trollope's books. Among my favorite novels are Ayala's Angel and Ralph the Heir. My favorite character is Miss Dunstable, who says of her unfashionable curls, they'll always pass muster when they are done up with banknotes.
All right, good. Well, I became introduced to Anthony Trollope in about 2015 when I was 51. So definitely a little bit later, and it was a little bit unusual circumstances. As part of my work as a neurologist, I perform neurological evaluations on people who are aggressive. And often these are people who are violent and they're on death row or facing a death sentence. And so I was asked to consult on a case in Arkansas, and I flew to Little Rock, and the attorney picked me up at the airport. His name is Scott Braden, and we had lunch together. And I happened to mention to Scott that I had just finished reading Middlemarch. And he said, "Oh, are you a fan of Anthony Trollope?" And I said, I've never read anything by Anthony Trollope. And he was shocked. And so I had to help him recover from that shock. And so we went, the next day we went to the prison, and I spent my 4 hours with this inmate. And then on the way from the prison to the airport, when we arrived Scott was driving me to the airport, and at the airport he said, "Okay, you must start reading Anthony Trollope." And so once again, the Warden pops up. And so this is a copy of the Warden that he gave to me. And I started reading it on the plane on the way home, and it's just been wonderful. I tell Scott all the time, he gave me the best gift I've ever received, because it's just been such a source of joy and happiness reading those books. I was mainly a nonfiction reader before. I read a lot of fiction, but I was interested more in nonfiction. But I've learned a lot from Anthony Trollope, because I think also actually pertaining to even the work that I do in terms of helping to understand what makes people sort of function and behave the way that they do. Trollope has just such a sensitivity and a tenderness about people's character, and a sort of prescient understanding of what creates character. And he would view it as people were endowed with certain gifts or certain talents. Nowadays, we would say it's a genetic factor, that people are the results of their genes and their environment, and people just are who they are, and they can't really be expected to change or behave differently without proper circumstances to allow that to happen. And Trollope really understood that very innately, and he speaks about it in a very kind way. So I really enjoyed it. It's been wonderful. I have a lot more books to read. And of course, echoing what other people have said, the Trollope Society Zoom meetings have been one of the, I won't say good, but less awful things to come about from the COVID pandemic. So that's my story.
Good evening, everybody. I live in Northampton in central England. Well, now, my story goes back to 1956, when I became a lowly bank clerk. Even in those days, perhaps rather like the three clerks, we used to sit on tall stools at sloping desks, writing up ledgers by hand. But being ambitious, I studied for the exams of the Institute of Bankers, and when I eventually completed them, I managed, rather to my surprise, to win a couple of prizes. Now, this unexpected distinction caused those in the corridors of power in the bank to wonder who this otherwise insignificant pen pusher labouring away at a remote country branch might be. So I was summoned to attend upon one of the great men in Lombard Street. Having eyed me up and down, this august personage condescended to say that I'd done quite well in the exams, and then he asked me what I planned to do next. Now, it seemed to me that at that stage, my future lay rather more firmly in his hands than in mine, although I thought it was probably wiser not to say so. But instead, I told him truthfully, as it happened, that I was thinking of reading for a law degree. But instead of applauding this evidence of continuing zeal, he seemed singularly unimpressed. "That's all very well, Long," he said, "but if you're going to be a banker, you must learn something about life." But then there was a pause. I didn't think there was really much for me to say unless I chose to disagree with him, which seemed rather risky. And so the conversation rather hung in the air. Eventually he went on. For example, if you found yourself seated at dinner next to a lady whom you had not previously met, how would you entertain her? A law degree will do little for you there. And in case I still haven't got the point, he went on, you've had your head for far too long in banking books, you know. That's all very well, but it's high time you read more widely. And at that point, he took a sheet of paper and he began to jot down a list of titles. David Cecil's Lord Melbourne, Eminent Victorians by Lytton Strachey, all good stuff. Winston Churchill's Great Contemporaries, and then some novels that I hadn't heard of. The Small House at Allington, The Eustace Diamonds, Phineas Finn. Have you read any Trollope? No, sir. Then it's time you did. He will teach you about people. 60 years later, I still have that list. I shied away from most of the biographies, but decided to try Trollope. Again, it was the Warden, and I went on to read the rest of the Barchester novels. At any rate, I gave up the idea of the law degree. Then, some years later, the foundation of this society rekindled my interest. I signed up, and his books have become an enduring joy ever since. And you perhaps won't be surprised to know that Trollope has taught me about people. That's my story.
Great. Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to briefly share some memories, really, of a very dear friend, colleague, and avid Trollopian, Dr. Peter Lee, who sadly passed away in 2017. Because he is the one who introduced me to the great man less than, well, not yet a decade ago. So we were down at our local pub in York, as you do, when I asked him about his literary tastes. And after some of the expected ones, I knew he was an avid reader of the Russian greats, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and so on. He mentioned a name that actually, an author that hadn't been covered in the English literature curriculum in the Netherlands when I went through school, and that was, of course, Anthony Trollope. When I asked Peter about the highlights of the oeuvre, he mentioned The Way We Live Now. So I made a mental note, and during the weekend I trotted off to the bookshop. I saw a copy of The Way We Live Now, that behemoth of a novel, and remembering my high school struggles with Dickens, of which we had to read at least one from start to finish in the original language, I very quickly decided that as a non-native speaker, I was not going to engage with that doorstop of Victorian fiction. Next time we met, undeterred, Peter suggested, well, you might have guessed, The Warden, because he said his reason was actually very simple. He said, after you've read The Warden, you'll want to read Barchester Towers. Now, The Warden looked altogether a more promising prospect, so I picked up a copy of that, and well, the rest, as the cliche goes, is history. Peter was, of course, absolutely correct. Barchester Towers followed soon after The Warden. One of the things I like about Trollope novels is that, being a foreigner in the UK, the novels do provide some interesting background, I suppose, to the country that I now call home. It's been said before many times, what I find remarkable about Trollope is obviously his ability to bring characters to life, characters who are dealing with what, in the grand scheme of things, are very small, and yet in their lives, as indeed in ours, are actually very important. Again, Mr. Harding springs to mind there. Reading him is like joining that avuncular uncle after dinner in front of the fire with a nice glass of port or two. He breaks all the rules of modern literary mores, constantly breaking the fourth wall. I love that. It's fantastic, just that you have an author who still does that. It's that ability to make you care about his characters, deeply care about his characters. And the wonderful thing I find that even if you don't care about his characters, he'll convince you that you should. Now, obviously, I'm not as far in the canon as some others. So I have some years forward, look forward to many more novels and evenings in Trollope's company, and I, for one, am certainly looking forward to those. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm Stan. I'm out west of Chicago, a few miles, and came upon Trollope, actually started reading him fairly recently, roundabout way. I actually read most of C.P. Snow's novels going back to the 1970s and was a big fan. And C.P. Snow, before he died in 1980, wrote a biography of Trollope, which I bought, actually never read. But I thought, well, if C.P. Snow thought well of him, he must be somebody I should read eventually. And it was on my list, picked up a few of the books, but never got around to reading them. I have a lot of books I haven't gotten around to read. But finally, I traveled a lot with my job for years and discovered audiobooks. And about 10 years ago, was on a trek where every week I had to drive about 5 hours each way and then sit in a hotel room and everything. So actually started listening to audiobooks of Trollope and started with the Warden, and found it was enjoyable and a lot better than I had anticipated after putting off reading Trollope for so many years. And had to then go to Barchester Towers. And with Barchester Towers, discovered Timothy West, who I've talked about before as sort of the consummate Trollope reader on audiobooks. He is a master and becomes Trollope for me. But it was in Barchester Towers that I, in his reading particularly, you can't listen to Timothy West without hearing the smirk in his voice on certain passages and things. And I can actually pin, I had to dig it up in Barchester Towers, that sort of, it was a hook for me that said, this is somebody I have to read more of. There's a scene which everybody knows, of Eleanor and Mr. Arabin, and they're tap dancing around the fact that she's been accused of being fond of Mr. Slope and all of this misunderstanding. And there's this very tense scene where they're very close to confessing that, that no, it was all misunderstanding. And the way it's written is, had she given way and sobbed aloud, as in such cases a woman should do, his words, not mine, he would have melted at once, implored her pardon, perhaps knelt at her feet and declared his love. Everything would have been explained, and Eleanor would have gone back to Barchester with a contented mind. How easily would she have forgiven and forgotten the Archdeacon's suspicion had she but heard the whole truth from Mr. Arabin. And this is the point that caught me. But then where would my novel be? She did not cry, and Mr. Arabin did not melt. And I actually replayed that on the audiobook, because it was so unexpected in the midst of a Victorian novel to have the author step out and break that fourth wall, so to speak, to talk directly to the reader with the humor that he showed as an author, and saying, and throughout his books, we've all discovered, yes, he always maintains, always the narrator, but he's also a character in his novels as the narrator. He, from time to time, talks about digressions, and in fact, wonderful book, if anybody comes across it, Trollope to Reader, is a collection of all those kinds of digressions. Somebody actually went through his entire canon to pull them all out. That one wasn't in that book. I looked for it. But that was the hook that got me. Of course, there's a lot more to Trollope than the smirky humor and the the Trollope to reader kinds of things. I, like other people have said, his depth of his characters is amazing. I read a number of Dickens beforehand. Dickens I can't really enjoy as much anymore because to me it strikes me as melodrama, not real substance. And as we just finished talking about the way we live now, the reality that it has even 150 years later is astounding, that he understood human situations. And actually getting back full circle, that's sort of what I found intriguing about C.P. Snow. When I first read him first, and I realized where C.P. Snow got his inspiration. His political novels are very absorbing. He doesn't have this humor that Trollope had, unfortunately. I still enjoyed his books, but they're definitely political books, and they do go into character studies, but he never really sort of steps out of his books the way that Trollope did. But I still enjoy Snow. But that's sort of how roundabout. So I'm a relatively recent convert. I do have all of the Trollope Society books. I'm marching my way through them. Good retirement project. So thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. You see me? I've told how I was an undergraduate in a class on the Victorian novel. I read Dr. Thorne for the first time and fell in love with it. I was 18 and it was 1965. But I did not go on to read more. The professor discouraged me from doing a paper on the novel and told me to do Dickens instead. 10 years passed, it's 1975, and I watched The Palaces on PBS TV in black and white, and I fell in love with that, particularly Susan Hampshire. And with my husband, we read all 6 novels. He'd read one, I'd read one, he'd read one, I'd read one. But we were very busy doing PhDs on other things, and I didn't go any further. It's then 1989. I was in a fearful car accident in New York City, and I landed in Metropolitan Hospital on the Upper East Side. I spent a week on that place. It has one man to do all the x-rays in the hospital. My husband promptly called him the bottleneck of the hospital. My father brought me a Dover copy of The Vicar of Bullhampton, saying that Trollope was very wise. It helped me get through that week. Still didn't go on. Finally, 1993, Jim and I got onto the net, that's my husband's name, through a phone line. And he said he would find something called a listserv for me. And he found one on Trollope. And I started leading groups reading Trollope. And the first one up was McDermott's of Ballycloran. And I admit, it was that first Irish tragedy that I have not stopped reading Trollope since. Partly I was invited to write a book and then an essay. I have to say each and every time there was always an outside prompt. Immersion in Trollope did not come from within in these cases, as it, for example, did with Jane Austen. Dominic asked us for an utterance, and the one that came to mind was one which shows how much meaning he gets in so very few words if you're listening. Great and terrible is the power of money, he says, in An Eye for an Eye. And what I like about Trollope is how he sees so deeply and accurately into how society's put together, and that he remains calm. He reminds me of Samuel Johnson. He has a very ironic humor, and you have to see him apart from his characters. And it keeps me going, how again and again, I see more each time I reread it. I am rereading The Vicar of Bullhampton on a Facebook page with people, and I'm learning all sorts of new things about it I never saw before. That's my story.
Okay, hello everybody. I'm Gwen calling in from New York. After retirement, I met Trollope through a book group at the Boston Athenaeum. I was curious as to why he wasn't included in Victorian Lit courses, which I loved and specialized in graduate school. I was so happily surprised by how wonderful he is and as powerful in his way as Dickens and Eliot. Here are some aspects of him that I find especially engaging. First, the variety of moral quandaries in which he places his characters. In The Landleaguers, is it right to force the son to confess to seeing who flooded his father's land, thus putting his life in danger? In Dr. Thorne, should Dr. Thorne have revealed to Mary her possible fortune, which would enable her to marry Frank? In The Warden, should Septimus resign and cave into the reformer's zeal? In The Eustace Diamonds, should Fawn dishonorably break an engagement or marry a woman in possession of stolen property? In Phineas Finn, should he have stuck to his guns and returned to Ireland, thus giving up a glittering career in London? These quandaries continue to fascinate today, as witness the huge popularity of the New York Times column, The Ethicist. Secondly, I find it moving that Trollope carries his characters into middle life and beyond, and with some depth. In The Last Chronicle of Dorset, this is devoted to the fortunes of the elderly Crawley. As an older person, I can sympathize with poor Crawley's missing check. It is especially engrossing to follow the fortunes of Palliser and Glencora, to understand their difficulties and good times as they move through life over the course of several novels. Many authors would end with Glencora at the altar, not so Trollope. The effect of this on me is to give me a greater understanding of what has gone on in my life over time. Thirdly, I find Trollope's sympathy for women and their very restricted lives remarkable, and makes me realize by contrast how lucky we are today. There's a moment in The Small House at Allington when a character says that sacrifices, little and big, are all made by women. This may not always be the case, but it's clear where the power ultimately lies. Finally, coming back to my original query as to why Trollope wasn't included in the pantheon of Dickens, etc., when I read Sir Harry Hotspur of Humblethwaite, I thought it was such a powerful treatment of the same themes as Washington Square, written 10 years earlier, and with greater compassion than James. I said to myself, he should be, and maybe he is by now. I don't know. I don't know what's going on in academia right now, but thank you to the Trollope Society for letting us talk about him together and share these wonderful novels.
Hi, I am overwhelmed with everyone and their depth of knowledge and history with Trollope. I'm not joined the society yet, but believe me, I will. So I have sort of an anti-Trollope beginning in my love of Trollope. I was working on a PhD in English literature and I never read Trollope, largely because he was never in the curriculum and was dismissed, I think, at the time. This was, gosh, early 70s, middle 70s. The new critics would have found him appalling because a book was to be untethered from an author, if I'm remembering my literary criticism correctly. And the author was never to come out of that back room, doors barred, and intrude on the story. It had to exist as an art form in and of itself. So my teachers pretty much poo-pooed Trollope, going back to high school, a great English high school teacher that said, oh, that's the guy with all the ticket names. So I had a bias against Trollope, and my life pivoted. I got a job in finance and then municipal government finance. And something made me read The Way We Live Now, which I sort of started at the end. And I was blown away by the depth of understanding of pettiness, money, relationships across purposes, all of the things you've talked about, the richness of the character, the humanity, even though it's considered his most cynical book, and some people say un-Trollope-like. So I read that and then kind of dropped Trollope for a while and read, it was an article in the New Yorker about the Trollope revival. And I thought, hey, I'm really missing out because I love this writer. So I was working in government finance, okay, in political environment. I started listening to Trollope on my long commute. So my daily life seemed to have been picked up by Trollope and put into the Palliser novels. And I was dealing with my own Quintus slide and the People's Banner, named differently, and I'm calling from San Diego. So I had these people in my life every day, and the political meat grinder, the low stakes didn't matter. Everybody was cutthroat, not everybody, but it was my life fictionalized. I'm not in the books, but it really drew me in. So I read the Pallisers, Barchester, the wonderful books. I have more to read, but it's interesting, this bias kept me away for years. And so decades later, kind of getting re-engaged with Trollope and loving it tremendously. I've also bored my husband with excerpts where I thought were just hysterical and had to read them out loud. Needless to say, he's not a Trollope fan. But I wanted to say, I think Jocko mentioned it, that breaking of the fourth wall was what you never did in a book that was considered a serious work of art, right? When I was learning my academic trade that I abandoned in English literature. And now I find that the most delightful part of the books. I mean, the stories, the characters, all of that, but that authorial intrusion, which is not supposed to happen, I think I'm reading it with modern eyes and taking a postmodern view and assuming that Trollope is actually winking, when he's saying these things. But I don't really care anymore because don't to please any graduate committee, I can take it as I find it and find the book so delightful, especially audiobooks. I've really enjoyed. I think my favorite narrator, somebody said, someone else, but Simon Vance. To me, he's the voice of the Palliser novels. So let's see, I think I've covered everything. I am reading Trollope really for the fun of it and loving every minute of it. And this group is fantastic, and thank you all for your insights.
And actually, it was interesting listening to these wonderful presentations because it's okay, I was going to say that, I was going to say that, I was going to say that. So a lot of things have already been taken from me. But my introduction was very low-key in that a decade or two, maybe, ago, a beat up copy of the Eustace Diamonds came into my life through some book sale or something. And I laughed out loud at that great opening line of the book. And it kind of really pulled me through. But I too got a degree in English and never heard of Trollope. And so I didn't realize there was a whole lot more Trollope than the one, that I had read. So it took a number of years later before I too had an awful commute and that I rediscovered Trollope in print, but also largely through audiobooks. And I'm a huge fan of Simon Vance. Somebody said of Simon Vance, when he does a dowager's voice, you can hear her stays creaking. He just does such a good job with it. But anyway, I listened to all sorts of his audiobooks. And I really do think that listening, and I thought, well, this is fair because in the Victorian era, people read books out loud to each other to while away the evening. So I thought it was a fair way to actually get to know Trollope through these long, rambling books, all those interlocking stories. And I do think that it kept me from shooting somebody during the DC region's traffic jams. And I think it also kept me from listening to too much radio news. Although I do think that the political novels had a lot to say about the current political scene that I was trying to avoid. And my very dear husband, who had a terrible knee injury and couldn't drive, so he got stuck. He was trapped in the back seat with a knee brace on, listening to twice daily doses of The Way We Live Now. He got to hear the whole novel. We were like a little mobile book club. And as a lot of people have brought up, that we just love all the contradictions of Trollope and how complex and how human the characters feel, that they're never so evil or so saintly, that they don't have some better or worse impulses or conflicting reasons for what they're doing. And as everybody has already mentioned, that the female characters who are so constricted by the era that they're in, and Trollope never really quite renounces the way the system is set up at that point, but his characters are so finely drawn, and that he's so quotable. You know, people say they read out loud to other people of these things who may or may not take them. And several people have brought up just that he's so Victorian, he's so of the era. And that's why you're kind of startled sometimes when his prejudices of the era come through the way they do. But that he's also so modern in a way, that whole thing of that breaking of the fourth wall. And you really start to wonder who the I is, who is talking so conspiratorially to you about the whole process of writing a novel. And I too was going to quote the thing from Barchester Towers about, well, then where would my novel be if everybody was doing smart things, you know? And my aforementioned husband has now even read a few more of the books. And he's always willing to talk Trollope with me and listen to quotes and things like that. I'm going to show something that's going to make you all very envious. I hope this comes through. Is it turning out correct? Okay. Wasn't that a wonderful Christmas present? What on earth could be more luxurious than a sofa, a book, and a cup of coffee? And but he never quite got sucked into the level that I have. And so one of the blessings of this horrible pandemic year was that I could find a whole bunch of people at the Trollope Society who were really happy to talk Trollope with me anytime, you know, that they wanted. And I've just learned so much and so many wonderful insights from all of the people here. And I just found out that there's a Trollopian living 40 minutes away from me in Bowie, Maryland. I was shocked. I did a little overreaction to that. But anyway, so thank you so much. And as I said, thank you so much for making all of these possible. And it's a beautiful website, and it's really well organized and so rich. There's so much there to see. So thank you so much to the Society.
No, I came to Trollope, I think, fairly early compared to some, because when I passed my 11 plus, when I was 10, my father gave me a set of sample English classics, and among them was The Small House at Allington. And I read that first when I was about, 13 or 14. And I can't particularly say why, but it just really spoke to me and I loved it. And I was desperate that Lily Dale would be happy. And I don't know how many times I've read it and how many times I've read The Last Chronicle of Barset, but each time I approach them, I just kind of hope somehow that it'll end differently, but of course, unfortunately, it doesn't. But so I loved that and went on during my teens to read all the other Barchester novels. And I mean, the Barchester Towers, I think, is one of the funniest books I've ever read. And of course, everybody will think of that spectacular scene at the bishop's party when the couch is wheeled over Mrs. Proudie's dress, and Bertie behaves so ridiculously, saying, "I'll fly to the wings of the fairies to mend your dress." And I mean, I think it is laugh out loud. And I introduced Trollope to the girls in my book group about 20 years ago. I just have read it ever since I was about 13. The political novels were really what kept me sane when I was doing all my accountancy exams. And I would just turn guiltily to them when I was really supposed to be learning how to read a set of accounts. I preferred reading Trollope, really, although in some mysterious fashion I did pass my exams, probably due to the Trollope helping me through. And since then, I've just discovered more and more, because thank goodness he wrote so many books, and many of them are available free on Kindle, which has been wonderful for me. So, and in latter years, I've enjoyed reading Simon Vance, yes, some of them, but Timothy West, I think, is the voice of Trollope for me. Although I think Simon Vance read The Vicar of Bullhampton, and he did that brilliantly. And then more recently, thanks to lockdown, I discovered the Trollope Society and these fantastic Monday evenings. And I'm very grateful to everybody because I love talking about it and I love listening. But very sadly, well, sadly in one way because it clashes, but nice in another way, my choir's restarting in September. So I will not sadly be able to come to the reading sessions anymore. But I will be singing, so I suppose that's good too. Thank you.